Let's start with the federal government and what Trump has ordered. As far as I can tell, the only thing the federal government has really ordered is the 15-day thing we keep hearing Trump talk about, that is going to be up a week from Monday. He's saying we're going to reassess, or we'll tell you at that point. So what's the most onerous things in that 15-day requirement or rules, and where does the federal government get the authority to do that?
Well, the first thing I would have is he actually really ordering anybody, or has it been really strong, we'll call it really strong suggestions? I haven't really ever got the impression that Donald Trump has ordered a nationwide quarantine as much as he has strongly suggested it. And that's, I haven't actually, like on the state and the counties, I have spent a lot of time studying what they have actually said. I've actually looked at the writings there. But as for the president and the United States, I haven't.
Yeah,
I haven't actually read the text of those.
So the 15 days to slow the spread, the president's coronavirus guidelines, which, as you point out, perhaps these are simply guidelines, and the federal government has not actually. It's if you feel sick, stay at home. If your children are sick, stay at home. If you're an older person, stay at home.
And we saw that with Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz came into contact with somebody who had the virus at CPAC. And so what did he do? He self-quarantined. Donald Trump came in contact with somebody who had the virus. What did he do? He went out and got tested. Those are the reasonable things that we really are getting from the federal government. If you come in contact with somebody, go self-quarantine yourself. If you know that you've come in contact with somebody who has the virus, go get yourself tested. Let's be safe. Let's be cautious. These are guidelines. I don't see the same level of what we see out of the state of California. We're not seeing out of the state of Florida, which has a lot more retired people than we see out of the state of California. The Florida governor hasn't come out with an executive order and said, you are to stay in place. Where are the places that you see these stay-in-place orders? You see them in California. You see them in New York. I believe Massachusetts has done one. Illinois has done one. Traditionally, solid blue states are the states that have come up with these executive orders where they've just taken the guidelines of the federal government and they said, no, they're not guidelines. You're to shelter in place.
Yeah. Well, and you mentioned something. We might as well. Politics is obviously going to enter into this. It has to. And you mentioned that these are blue state, meaning Democrat governors. What is it that causes a Democrat governor to be more inclined to implement tough safety measures compared to a Republican governor, for instance, like the one you have in Florida?
I think the issue is a difference in perspective and a respect for the Constitution and the concepts of personal responsibility and personal liberty. As a child, you chaffed at your parents telling you when you had to go to bed and who your friends could be. You couldn't wait to grow up to be able to make your own decisions. And that seems to be one of the biggest differences between Republicans and Democrats, is that the desire of liberty, the desire of, I don't want the government to tell me what to do. Whereas in the Democrat circles, they are much more open to government control and government dictatorial power. In the Republican circles, they are much more about freedom and liberty, where I am an adult, I can hear what the media is telling me, I can read the scientific reports, and I'm going to make the decision that's best for me and my family. Whereas in the Democrat states, you see much more of a willingness to say, no, I'm going to make that decision for you. So the way how I kind of portray it is, a Republican governor is more like a parent who has a 23-year-old living at their house, maybe home for summer, from college for the summer, versus a Democrat governor is somebody who has a 13-year-old. living at the house. There's a little bit more control that a parent should exercise over their 13-year-old than over their 23-year-old. And I see the Republicans treat their constituents more like the 23-year-old child, and Democrats tend to treat their constituents more like a 13-year-old.
Yeah, well, I tend to agree with you. But if there was ever a need for government, you would think this would be the time. I think the issues at play are what you just described, but also trying to understand, okay, who's right here? Is the Florida governor right to not impose all this stuff and not hurt his economy as much? Or is the California governor right that, no, this is a serious public safety concern. This thing is going to spread like wildfire. Millions are going to die if we don't implement these draconian shutdown measures. I think that 6 months from now or a year from now, we're going to look back and we're going to say one guy was right and one guy was wrong.
Well, let's go back to World War II. Pearl Harbor happened. 74 days later, the President of the United States, FDR, was under so much political pressure that he did something. He had to do something. And what was the something that he did? He interned the Japanese. He took away their property. He took away their liberty. He took away their right to pursue happiness, all in the name of political expediency of doing something to protect the Americans. And now as we look back at it, as constitutional scholars look back at it, we clearly see that he violated the Japanese Americans' constitutional rights. And we say, you know what, you do not have the right as a politician, in the name of political expediency, to take away the constitutional rights. What is the Constitution? The United States Constitution and state constitutions are contracts between the people and the government. It is a document that's not really designed to limit people. It is designed to limit the government and to say, government, there are some areas that you just do not have control over. And that's why we have the Bill of Rights, to say, hey, Congress, you cannot touch the Second Amendment rights to bear arms. Congress, you cannot authorize unwarranted searches and seizures. And one of the things that I actually find so interesting is the Third Amendment. The Third Amendment is probably the least litigated amendment.
Please don't ask me what it says.
The Third Amendment is the one that soldiers cannot force themselves into your house and make you house them and feed them. During the Revolutionary War, what would happen is the British would come into town and they'd basically find the nicest house and they'd basically plant themselves there and they would make you feed them. You go kill your cows, go kill your chickens, and some of the generals actually paid, but most of them did not. And it was government forced itself upon your personal rights, your home, your ability to make a living, your ability to feed your people. And the Founding Fathers were so upset about that they put in the Third Amendment, in the Bill of Rights, that government does not have the power to supersede over your home. That is your personal property. That is your personal sphere of influence. And so what we understand as we now look at what is going on, and let's look at the state of California. It started in San Francisco. San Francisco basically was as far as I can tell by timeline, was the first county to do the shelter in place. You're not going to go, we're taking the recommendations of the federal government. We're taking the recommendations of the state of California, but we're going to actually use our police powers, and we're going to enforce it. And you are ordered to stay at home. Now, the statute that the county of San Francisco and the Bay Areas utilized is a statute that has been around for a long time. This is actually not the first time in the state of California's history that public health officials have tried to use their authority to quarantine people. And those issues have been litigated. Not once, not twice, multiple times. And the courts have said that public health officials have the authority to quarantine people who they reasonably believe to be infected by the virus or have been around people or likely to be infected by the virus. They have to show, and it's a legal term, probable cause. If they don't want to get a judicial warrant to quarantine somebody, they have to be able to articulate probable cause that somebody has the virus or has been around somebody who has the virus.
Probable cause as to a particular individual or a swath of people, for instance, by age?
It has to be person by person, because here in California we have Article 1, Section 1 of our Constitution. It is actually much stronger than the Bill of Rights, and the courts have constantly interpreted it stronger than the Bill of Rights. In Article 1, Section 1, you have a right to liberty. You have a right to obtain property and maintain property. And the courts, looking at these quarantine orders that were not specifically articulated as to that person, they said if you do not have proximate cause to determine that that person has the virus, you cannot deprive them of their liberties. You cannot deprive them of their ability to obtain and maintain property, which is a job.
Were these courts looking at quarantines that applied to everyone as these do?
Yeah, they were applied to quarantines where they said you have taken away a person's right without actually making a determination that that individual has.
Right. And in that circumstance, was it like today where the city or county had ordered everyone to stay at home? What was the example in that case, if you recall?
I don't recall that one. I've read way too many cases, but I mean, it's been.
I'm just wondering how unprecedented is it for there to be an order that applies to everyone? Do we know, has that ever happened in California before, that it applied to everyone as this one does?
You got to remember that the Spanish flu was killing tons of people in the United States during World War II or World War I, and these cases arose out of the World War I epidemic that we call the Spanish flu today. It is, their governors.
And that was a way bigger killer than this.
Oh, 70,000 people. I think something like 70,000 people were killed in the United States alone from it. It was like
with a much smaller population.
Yes, and it was more. I think more people in the United States died because of the Spanish flu than died in World War I.
So California was trying to, or California counties were trying to implement something similar to what they're doing today to control the Spanish flu, and the courts said no, it was overly broad, this restriction you put in place. It needs to be narrowly tailored, essentially, to people who have been infected or you can reasonably suspect have been exposed to infected people.
Basically, if you know that your wife had tested positive, they could quarantine you and your children.
And by the way, I think that's how South Korea was doing. I've just been reading about South Korea, and they were very strict about, as soon as they learned that somebody in particular had it, they would send notices out to that neighborhood, and anybody in that ballpark was now quarantined.
Yeah. And that's because our Constitution protects that individual right. You know what? I'm not saying that people shouldn't, as I mentioned earlier, Ted Cruz self-quarantined the second he realized that he might be infected. Let's go do the test. Let's quarantine myself. You know what? There are people who are in their 60s and 70s, or people who have diseases who know that they're more susceptible to it. Those type of individuals, they're responsible adults. They know better than to just go out into the public. I have plenty of friends in the political world who, let's say, are 70 years old. As soon as this thing came out, they basically told all their friends, I'll see you in a couple months. We're just going to stay home and have a home vacation. That is prudence. That is liberty. That is how things are supposed to work. What you're not supposed to do is say to that 30-year-old okay, let's do it this way. Let's say you have twin brothers, 22 years old. One of them has a job at the grocery store. The other has a job at the local bar. Now, they both went to the same school. They have the same amount of student debt. They live together. But one of them is allowed to interact with people and make money, and the other one is forced to stay home. What we are doing with this policy right now is the government is picking winners and losers. If you got a government job, you're going to get your paycheck. But if you work at a restaurant, if you are a small business owner and you own a dentist shop, you're going to be staying home. But if you own a bar, you're staying home. But if you have a grocery store, you get to work.
Yeah, but there is a rational basis behind them picking those winners and losers, essential workers versus non-essential. And it does seem to me they've divided that up appropriately. But even before you get to that, what you're saying is if it's not narrowly tailored to people who either have it or have been in proximity to it, that inherently is overbroad based on prior court rulings. There's court precedent in California saying, sorry, guys, unconstitutional, can't do it.
Exactly.
And you don't hear many people saying this other than you and maybe a handful of others.
I was one of the first to come out with this. I've been seeing some people who have started to say this over the weekend. I started to see stuff in other states. This issue has been you're starting to see more and more people talk about it. I've been informed by people in D.C. that I was one of the first people out there who actually raised this issue.
Yeah, and the issue that we're talking about is not what if there was no Constitution, if there was no rules, just what should we do? You could have a reasonable argument that you'd have half the people saying, I like what California's doing, we should shut everything down, and the other half would say, no, I think that this is too much. But you need to look at what's going on in the context of the governmental system that we live under. And as you point out, we have a Constitution that's been around for 250 years on the federal level and whatever number of years. 170 years on the California level that we've all bought into and said, we hold that up here, and everything else, you cannot violate the Constitution. I think most people agree. Yeah. You cannot violate the Constitution.
The state of emergency powers that the governor have, in that power, it gives the governor authority to suspend regulations and statutes. And he has done so regarding our elections. Usually in the elections, the states have 30 days to certify the election. He expanded it to 51 days. That is completely within his power. But if you study the powers of the governor under the State of Emergency Act, and it says that here are the enumerated powers, which means if it's not in that list of powers, he does not have. And one of the things that he does not have is the ability to suspend your constitutional rights. He could suspend a statute, he could suspend a regulation, but he cannot suspend the Constitution.
Okay, so let's stay now. Well, let's go back to federal, and it looks like we've confirmed. I just looked it up on my computer while we were that you're 100% correct. That federal is guidelines. Yeah. So the federal government hasn't ordered anything. They've issued guidelines that the states have now and counties have taken and kind of run with, as you point out. So now, as far as what has Newsom and the state of California done, what has he ordered? And then we'll get to the counties and cities. What has he ordered that you believe may be unconstitutional?
Okay. First off, if you look at you got to look at everything in order. First, he declared a state of emergency, perfectly within his rights to do so. Issued the state of emergency. Now he's exercising under his state of emergency powers when he gives executive orders. In his executive order last Thursday night, he stated that the executive order was that we were to heed the directives of the public health authorities. That word heed means to take consideration. So if you're to take the actual legal analysis of what Gavin Newsom did with his executive order was to the people of California, as you make your decisions in your daily life, you are to consider the advice of the California Department of Public Health in your decision making. That is what the actual words of the order say. Now, what does he say that they said? Well, he went out on Twitter. He said in his press conference, I have ordered this shelter in place. His order actually does not say that. His order does not say that there's a shelter-in-place order for the state of California.
Just to be clear, because it's really important what you're getting at, heed does not mean must follow?
You got it.
Because, I trust you that you've looked up the definition, and the legal and this has been interpreted by courts, what heed means?
Heed is not a word that's interpreted in the court. You have to go to the Merriam-Webster dictionary to figure out what it means.
And so you believe that was very clearly intentional to use that word, because if he had used you must follow these, they recognize that would probably have been unconstitutional.
He's been using this word heed throughout the whole entire time. Whether he's doing it intentionally or accidentally, I don't know, but he's consistently using the word heed. And as you go and look at the word heed, it does not, I've looked in Black's Law Dictionary. Black's Law Dictionary doesn't even define it. It's not defined in our code section. So you have to go to the English dictionaries, and the English dictionaries do not – it is a strong suggestion language. Mm-hmm. So
and you would say probably intentionally done by him in recognition that he's not able to order these things.
Anybody who studies the history of quarantine law in California understands he doesn't have the authority to order statewide quarantine. So I think his advisors have actually advised him very well. He wants everybody to stay at home. Where the problem has come in is that all the sheriffs and the highway patrol and the meter maids all have this assumption that it is actually an order, and they are now enforcing it through the law. So whether or not he actually ordered it, it's being treated as an order.
And he's speaking of it as if it's an order.
Exactly. It's a case where his spoken word is giving a lot more precedent than what the written word is. And I think it's creating, whether it's intentional what he's doing or I have no way. I think it's intentional that he, to try to create a little bit of.
And have you been looking only at California?
I have predominantly only looked at California.
Because New York's got the same thing.
Yeah, I'm a California attorney. That's where I'm allowed to advise my clients.
Presumably, New York's got the same problem. They probably have a similar constitution to California, and their governor's probably violating it, as our governor sort of is.
Yeah. Well, if somebody who studied the constitutions of the states, the constitutions of the state tend to model themselves off of the federal government, unless you're doing the 13 states that were before the federal government, in which the federal government goes off of the 13 states, and they're building blocks. And so when the state of California had its initial constitution in 1850, and then the subsequent one, I think, was 1871 or 73, I can't remember what year, they're modeling them off of other states. And since California was around after New York, there are going to be a lot of provisions in the California Constitution that you are going to see in the New York Constitution, in the Illinois Constitution, states that had constitutions before California.
Okay. So before we talk about counties and cities, one more thing with the state. Are you aware of actual examples of state officials treating his, heating requirement, because we're not going to call it an order, treating it as an order and enforcing it?
Everything I've heard has come from the county sheriff level. I haven't heard anything from. So
it'd be Highway Patrol is state.
Highway Patrol is the state, and I have not heard any instances that have come from Highway Patrol. Now, what I have heard is the Chief Justice of the state courts has ordered all the courts to stop doing jury trials, but that's within its prerogative. They've kept the court systems open. I talked to a criminal attorney yesterday. He's not going into court. He's doing telephone calls. The criminals aren't going to the court. The judge is just basically doing everything by telephones. That is within the prerogative of the Chief Justice of the state of California to say, you know what? We're going to take the recommendations given us by the federal government, the state government, and the county governments. We're just not going to put people in where they have to go appear in court. We're going to suspend all of our jury trials for a couple months. So that is an example of where the state has used its authorities, but it hasn't punished somebody. It's actually keeping the system going.
Right. But without a doubt, we do think while Newsom's order might be technically constitutional, Newsom has been conducting himself in a way as to act as if that is a order by the state that restricts people's liberty regardless of whether you have the virus or not, and that's clearly unconstitutional. He should know it, and it's really not appropriate for him to be acting the way he's been acting at public news conferences.
I would say that his words clearly violate both the spirit and the letter of the California Constitution, and probably even the United States Constitution, because you have rights to equal, due process and equal protection under the U.S. Constitution. There's also the issue of your First Amendment rights of right to associate. When he came in and shut down all events over 250 and shut down all the churches, that you have a right to peaceably assemble. Now, government does have the reasonable time, place, and manner restrictions, narrowly tailored restrictions. And the question then becomes, is this a narrowly tailored restriction or is this not? And the question is, well, you know what? He initially said, restaurants, 50% occupancy. Let's spread people out. You're going to be allowed. But then he said 24 hours later, no, all restaurants and bars have to be closed. I think the first one might have passed the mustard as something that was narrowly tailored. I'm a triathlete. I go out there and I work outside. I work out all the time outside. Well, you know what? Because the races that I was doing had over 250 people, the race organizers all shut down based upon the governor's orders. Was that something that really needed to be shut down? People were outside exercising, swimming. You're not going to catch it in the water. People are riding their bikes. You have in these races, you have to be more than 6 meters apart, which is well beyond the 6 feet. People are running. You're in the fresh air. That's not where people aren't coughing on each other. These are some of the healthiest people and people least likely to get it. So, is this really a narrowly tailored statute? And so I think that there is an argument that it violates the First Amendment right of association. Because he shut down churches, it violates, Congress shall pass no law regarding the, religion. Because of what's going on with the gun stores, it's probably violating the Second Amendment, due process, and equal protection. So, yes, it's very clear that it's violating the state law, but it also has
state constitution.
But there's also some pretty strong arguments that are going to be coming up in the next couple weeks, and that regarding has it also violated the U.S. Constitution.
Mm-hmm. As you point out, there's actually been multiple orders from Newsom. Has every one of them used the word heed?
Pretty much.
Okay.
Not all of them are, he's entered so many executive orders. I'm probably today or tomorrow going to be doing a YouTube live on the topic of just every executive order that has come out of Gavin Newsom's mouth as a result of this. I mean, it's like every day there's a new executive order. Not all of them are related to what the people are to do. Some of them are utilizing his authority. Okay, we're going to make sure that our schools stay funded because schools are funded based upon how many days they're open. Well, we're going to make sure that next year's school budget is not deprived because we had to close everything up this year. So some of them have absolutely nothing to do with shelter in place or anything like that. They're like the executive orders regarding the elections. But when he has come out, when he's been talking about following public health directives, he has used the word heed. He's been very consistent that way.
What about schools? He's ordered the schools closed. No?
Yes.
Okay. How do you evaluate that from a constitutional perspective?
The law on quarantine is actually pretty explicit that they have the power to just basically shut down the schools during that issue.
Public and private?
I'd have to go and look at it. I don't think it's been interpreted. I didn't look at it very carefully, but the quarantine law indicated that in order to protect the spread of it, they have the ability to ensure. Now, the question becomes, because it's a statute a couple below the one that says that's been interpreted by the courts as to only allow them to quarantine those people who they know. Does that mean that the courts would interpret that as, okay, you can't make somebody who they know has this to go to school? You know, there needs to be some more research on it, but the plain reading of it tends to indicate that the state has power to just kind of shut down the schools.
Yeah, you would certainly think as to the public schools it would have that. But back to the personal liberty, which is in the California Constitution, what that clearly would apply to is limiting someone to that you can't leave your home except under these circumstances. That is a clear violation of personal liberty. That the courts have already said that.
Yes.
Right?
And also, our Article 1, Section 1 says the right to obtain and maintain property. If you are a small business owner, let's say that you own a bar, you're not allowed to open that bar. That means you're not allowed to go down there because they're saying that you have to stay at home. You're not allowed to maintain that property, to protect that property, and you're left up to the National Guard, if it gets called in, or the police to guard it. Who are the people who are most likely to disobey this order? The people who are lawbreakers. And lawbreakers are looking for opportunities. Home burglaries have gone down with everybody staying at home. What has gone up? Break-ins at businesses that there's nobody there to protect. By making everybody stay at home, you're decreasing the opportunity for people to protect their property. Also, when you shut down a business, let's say it's a bar, that bartender now does not have the ability to obtain property. You have cut off their constitutional right just because they're a bartender to go out and obtain property, because they can't make the money, they can't go, buy additional property. There are so many problems with what's going on because we're quarantining everybody and we're making the decision as to what is essential and what is not essential. Mm-hmm. And here's just a common sense. Let's put a little common sense into this. Because we're rationing milk and eggs to, 1 gallon and 1 dozen eggs, if you are a family of 5, you're going to have to go to the grocery store every single day, which means you're being put into contact with somebody at the grocery store every single day. And here's the deal. Because we're closing our restaurants down, more people have to go to the grocery store. So instead of spreading everybody out, what we have done is we've forced everybody into a consolidated area. And because we've put rationing principles in, people have to go there even more. And that's why you're going to the grocery stores and you're seeing a lot of empty aisles and stuff like that, because you're forcing everybody, rather than to spread out, their food purchases between the restaurants and the grocery stores. Now everything's at the grocery store, and because of rationing, everybody has to go to that grocery store.
Everybody's standing in line together, and whether it be waiting outside a restaurant to get in or waiting to get into a grocery store. I had that experience this weekend. I went to Joshua Tree National Park. Joshua Tree National Park on Saturday closed. I don't know if you've been there, but this is a 60-mile wide park in the middle of the desert, wide open. They close it, so what do you have? You have all these people at the entrance congregating. They were turning cars away, but they're allowing people to walk into the park. Okay. So there's all these people now hiking in Joshua Tree Park all together instead of being spread out among the 60 miles. I checked all the other parks. Yosemite National Park
is now closed.
Sequoia Park, all the national parks have closed, these huge wide open spaces.
Yeah. I mean, I went for a run on Sunday morning up to Mount Wilson over Los Angeles. And you know what? It was a 5-mile on a paved road that was closed because they've closed the observatory. I was probably, most of the time, the closest person to me was at least a mile. I mean, that's on average during that run. Here's the deal. just the other day we saw L.A. County is closing down all the hiking trails in the foothills. Why? I mean, people are in the fresh air. They're getting exercise because they hear a couple complaints that people were within the 6 feet of each other. Well, if they're not coughing on them right there, yeah, these trails are narrow. You're going to pass every now and then, but it's not like these people were endangering. It is.
Yeah. Well, you pointed out internment after or during World War II after Pearl Harbor, and you could cite example of Americans overreacting to a dramatic incident. It is human nature to have fear, panic, and overreaction set in. Mm-hmm. And, there's a lot of good arguments that says that that's what happened after 9/11, that we overreacted to 9/11. And you kind of look at it like,
but we opened up our airports within 4 days of 9/11. Within 4 days of 9/11, we reopened the economy. This, we are, I like to go back to FDR's phrase. The only thing to fear is fear itself. And unfortunately, as you're saying right now, people are fearing, and it's allowing the politicians to overstep the limitations that are put upon them. Mm-hmm. And we're letting them to do it. And, and I've been attacked by some of the things that I've said on, today I've said it on YouTube, and I've been attacked saying, you know what, I've been a lifelong, liberty-loving American, and I think that, you are the problem. No, I'm saying in the same way that you don't tell a curfew to your 23-year-old is the same thing. Americans are smart enough. We live in the information age. In between Facebook, the internet, Twitter, the news media, cable news, you have the ability to get the information out there. Now, you have to use your brain and use critical thinking skills to figure out what's important and what's not important. But here's the deal. You have a greater chance of being killed in a car accident than you do dying of coronavirus in the United States right now.
Yeah, and I do think cars is a really important example. I've been using that a lot because we know tens of thousands of people die every year from car accidents, but we don't shut down driving. There is risk associated with life. We all choose to accept that risk, but all of a sudden, people are in this, if we could save one life, it's all worth it. Wrong. It's not worth it. That's not the way we conduct ourselves. That's not the way we live our lives, especially not as Americans.
What we're going to do, this is going to have a long-term impact. We already were hearing words about the bloated pensions in the state of California. What's going to happen because the stock market has tanked to all these cities? If you remember what happened in 2008 when the stock market crashed, cities had to start laying off firefighters and police departments because they had designated amount of money that they had to pay for pensions for people who no longer worked. What's going to happen if real estate prices start having to fall because people have to start pulling more money out, have to start selling their real estate in order to pay their bills? If we have a real estate crash like we did in 2008, now that means our cities are going to get less tax dollars out of property tax. Now, over the next 6 months, people are going to have to recover from this, not working for a couple months, which means they're going to restore their personal finances, which means they're not going to be going to restaurants. They're not going to be going to the movie theaters. They're not going to be doing stuff. Thus, they're not going to be spending their dollars and the sales tax that's going to be affecting the communities. Our communities are going to be hit because of the stock market crash and what that's going to do to the pensions. They're going to have to lay off essential personnel in these counties and cities. We're probably going to see several cities actually have to file bankruptcy in the near future because the sales people are going to be spending less to try to regain their personal financial footing. You're going to see less sales tax, which means less money for the cities, and you're going to probably see less property taxes because property values are going to fall. All of the result is because we've crashed our economy because our politicians have overstepped their authority.
What I find interesting about that is here the Constitution is there to protect us, right? And it really, if it had been followed, it would be there protecting us right now against politicians overreaching and crashing the economy. So the courts had already interpreted our Constitution and struck a proper balance when it comes to quarantining people in circumstances like this. As you point out, we've had this before. We had the Spanish flu.
Yeah.
There's court cases on this interpreting what you're allowed to do in these circumstances. If we had followed those court cases, we would be doing all those things.
Just like Donald Trump is doing. It's guidelines. And you know what? If you're 70 years old, you don't go get on a cruise ship right now. You don't get on a airplane right now. You stay home.
Or if you have a major health condition.
Or you have a major health condition.
Right, over a certain age, and those people should be self-quarantining and being extremely cautious about interacting with anyone. My parents are in their 80s. They're in good health. Easter's coming up. I was planning to visit them.
And they said, stay home. We don't want to
see. They still wanted to see us because they love their kids so much and they love seeing us. But it's the kids, actually, that are saying, we're not going to risk interacting with you. That's the way to do it. It doesn't require a total shutdown. But most important for this conversation, forget about what you should do or shouldn't. You're saying it violates the Constitution. So either you believe in the Constitution or you don't. We don't have a provision that allows the Constitution to be suspended under exigent circumstances, correct?
There's one provision of the Constitution that they have the ability to suspend. But it's in the Constitution that says that this provision can be suspended. Abraham Lincoln gets a lot of people are upset at Abraham Lincoln for suspending the rights of habeas corpus. But it's in the Constitution that says he has that authority during a time of war. He utilized his war powers to suspend certain rights under the Constitution. That is the only provision of the Constitution that I'm aware of that has the right to be suspended. Every other constitutional right that you have, they do not have the right to suspend, whether it's a state of emergency or a state of war.
And same with California.
Same with California.
So, are there any lawsuits yet challenging these orders?
My firm has been in communication with a lot of potential clients. We have not filed one yet. I do know that there are people in the gun owners realm, the gun stores, that are looking at doing something. I have not heard that any lawsuit has been filed yet. I know, this is still fresh. We're about a week. It's, you have to make sure that you have the right case, and, these type of lawsuits are going to be very expensive.
Well, on the one hand, I get it. You need time to evaluate the case and so on. But on the other hand, just as the governors are saying these are exigent circumstances, these need to be implemented right away, they are tanking our economy and destroying our liberties as we speak. So it's almost as if we need to be in court immediately challenging these, trying to get a temporary restraining order to keep the state from destroying our economy.
I'm not going to argue with you there, but I've done some pretty high level litigations against the state, and if you're going to be suing the state on constitutional violations, it's not just something that a solo attorney is going to just be able to go in there and win. You really need a powerful team, a group of attorneys that are working together, because you're going to have a bunch of attorneys working around the clock. I've cited some information that comes from 30 hours of research that I've done on this issue, and I've just scraped the top of it. The level of research that would need to be done just before you could even file one of these lawsuits to get a federal judge or a state judge to go, yeah, the state is unconstitutional, you're probably talking, I would say, at minimum 500 hours of attorney time.
Okay,
if you actually wanted to be successful. If all you wanted to do is go raise some money and highlight this issue, yeah, I could have filed a lawsuit yesterday. I could have filed a lawsuit on Friday. It would have been bare bones, but the likelihood of success would have been very small. If you actually want to have a successful lawsuit that actually comes down and tells the state of California, no, you have overstepped your bounds.
But there's a lot of public interest law groups out there, oftentimes on what would be considered the left, but I know there's some on the right. Isn't like Pacific Law Foundation?
Yeah.
Why aren't they bringing this case? Because I get it. I know it requires a lot of work, but the way you're describing things, this is a clear-cut violation of the California Constitution, if not the U.S. Constitution.
But as we mentioned, I was one of the first attorneys in the nation that started talking about this. And, it's because I got tired of people saying, are we in martial law? And I just started down a rabbit trail. And it was 30 hours of research, and that all of a sudden finished the day that, Gavin Newsom does executive order. So I was in a position to immediately come out there and talk about it. Mm-hmm. You got a lot of law firms that have all their employees at home. They're not sitting in a room talking and discussing and doing the research.
It really does need to be what they call pro bono work. It needs to be essentially for free. It needs to be a foundation that is funded by people who are concerned about government overreach. That's the type of entity that or firm that needs to bring this, and hopefully it will, because what I envision happening is right now the federal government and the states are relatively aligned. But with Trump pushing more and more to ease his own guidelines, if the states are going their own direction, look, if California and New York are shut down, the U.S. is shut down. So the control over this right now is with the governors.
Yeah.
Right?
Well,
And so my point being, one of these lawsuits may be necessary.
Ever since I did that YouTube video, within hours of Gavin Newsom doing his executive order, my phone has been going off the hook, and I've been talking to people. And, unfortunately, I'm not a nonprofit entity. I work in a mid-sized firm that, survives on people being able to pay their bills. And so I need a case where maybe it's a group of restaurants or, somebody who owns a franchise that's had to lay off hundreds of employees.
A restaurant association.
That's who has to be my client.
And you would go in and try to get first a temporary restraining order, right?
Yes, that would be the most logical thing to do.
Mm-hmm. And let's talk about. We only have a few more minutes. Let's talk about guns real quick. So, is it the city or the county of LA that has been issuing these restrictions on closing of stores, saying that
my understanding is it's the city of LA.
So city of LA,
but it's the county sheriff that's enforcing it. So that's really been a little confusing, because I have not heard that the county supervisors have put a shelter in place. All I've heard is that the shelter in place came from the mayor of LA, but it's the sheriff that's enforcing it, and so it's like. It does not make any sense. There seems to be a lot of confusion here in L.A. County and L.A. City as to who's actually making these orders and who's enforcing these orders. I mean, if it's a city ordinance, then it would be the city police that's supposed to enforce it. The mayor of L.A. doesn't have authority over L.A. County Sheriff, but it's not making sense to me.
Well, let's stick with L.A. So L.A. City has put in some. These are real restrictions. California, he's saying heed these, so it's not really clear whether these are actual orders that are enforceable by force of law.
And let me tell you a fun story. Actually, one of the things that got me started into looking at executive orders and everything like that, because I was reading a book about the 1906 earthquake. And in it, they talked about how the city was under martial law. And as I started researching it, I discovered that the governor of California never actually issued a order of martial law. He never ordered the National Guard to come in and maintain peace and order. What had happened was the mayor of San Francisco basically told the press, I have told the National Guard that they are to shoot on sight anybody who is looting or whatever. That was not within the authority of a mayor. A mayor does not have the authority to declare a state of emergency. The mayor does not have authority over the National Guard, and a mayor doesn't have the authority over a county sheriff. And so Mayor Garcetti could say a lot of things, but is he actually saying stuff that's within his authority? The National Guard, the president has some authority over it with the permission of a governor. A governor has control of it. But even a governor does not send in the National Guard to a city unless he has the permission of the city. And so what we're seeing right now is that politicians who are wanting to do something, they're wanting to go out and talk to the media and say, I'm doing something about this crisis. They're not checking with their lawyers. They're not checking with their constitution. They're not following, proper police powers, and they're not following proper authority guidelines of who has the authority. They're just saying stuff. And at the end of the day, we might find out, like the 1906 earthquake, it's the biggest urban legend out there that martial law was in the city of San Francisco during the earthquake, because there was never that authority granted. But you can still go to Wikipedia today, and you're going to see that people believe martial law was called out during the 1906 earthquake. But legally, it never happened. The perception is there, but legality is that it never happened.
Mm-hmm. So Garcetti's order, I think, is similar to San Francisco's order in a bunch of counties up there, which is basically shelter in place. You can only leave your home to go to the grocery store, go to the doctor, go care for a family member, or to go to an essential job.
Yeah.
Right? Otherwise, and you would say 1,000% that's unconstitutional based on prior court rulings.
Based upon my reading of what happened in the Spanish flu and how the courts interpreted it, that is completely outside of the guidelines, because a public health official is not allowed to quarantine somebody who has not been, they do not have probable cause, has the virus, or has been associated with somebody that has the virus.
And in turn, he's trampled over gun rights because he says, well, an essential job is not selling guns. Garcetti says this. That's not an essential job. So gun stores, you are shut down. And apparently he stepped in it with that, because it appears as of this morning that they may have already reversed that, because basically he's saying that I'm going to deny you your Second Amendment right to bear arms because you can't go get one.
Yeah,
I've shut down the gun stores.
And what's so funny is, because we have 10-day waiting periods, you know, when this started happening, a lot of people went out there and bought guns, and all of a sudden learned that they had a 10-day waiting period. And then now with gun stores being shut down, how can they go even pick up their gun in 10 days? And because of how the shelter-in-place rules are going on, the longer this goes on, the people who can't pay their grocery bill because they don't have a job, they live paycheck to paycheck, they're going to start wanting to loot and riot and everything like that. We are sitting on a tinderbox. I mean, I've been actually impressed with the people of California that we haven't gone to riot mode yet. But every day that this is going on is that much more likely that somebody is not going to be able to pay their bills. They're going to just steal something at the grocery store. It's going to turn into a riot very quickly, plunder and deceit. And we're going to see the National Guard called out very, very quickly to maintain peace and order. And we are making it worse because we got politicians, you know, cutting off people's ability to make money and cut off people's ability to actually protect their property.
Yeah. Well, and I'll give you one last example before we finish, is the extent of Garcetti's order, because he expressly stated this. You cannot leave your home in Los Angeles to go to your vacation home in Palm Springs. I'm going to leave my home, get in my car, drive to my property in Palm Springs, get out of the car and go into my house. No. Shelter in place, you're not permitted to go to your vacation home.
You know, this is having an effect on a lot of different people. I had people who were actually planning on moving out of the state. Now all of a sudden, because moving's not an essential service, can't move out of the state. People who are supposed to get married this weekend are not going to be allowed to get married this weekend. Yeah, they can go have a justice of the peace wedding, but I mean, this is having a dramatic effect on the lives of a lot of people, because the politicians don't want to leave it at a guideline or a recommendation. They want to be able to say that they are doing something. And the Constitution doesn't allow them that authority, but they don't care. They're going to be like that mayor in San Francisco in 1906, and they're going to just say stuff, whether it's true or not, because they want to be perceived as being fighters on this issue.